And I encourage people listening right now to Google why do startups fail, and you'll find 10 lists. Yeah. Fast Company, top 10 lists, reasons why startups fail. There's all kinds. Harvard Business Review. There's all kinds of 10 lists, top 5 lists, whatever it might be. And I can guarantee that one of the top 3 answers in almost all of these lists that I've ever come across are, we didn't understand the market needs. Now you might say, yeah, but Jim, we're not a startup. We're a big legacy company. And I would say, okay, Google, why does innovation fail? Innovation being create meaningfully unique value. And it's not as high as for startup failure, but it's in the top 5. One of them is we didn't understand our customers and we didn't understand our customer needs.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what you described. That's the gap that Jobs to be Done fills.
Right.
So we started it's almost like the center of the earth. It's like, let's strip away all these other factors, the emotions, the social aspects, the overarching aspirations, all the different contextual factors that might play. Let's strip all that away. And at the middle is this core, right? Let's start there, understand that, and then layer all these other concerns on top of it.
Today's guest is a highly experienced Jobs to be Done practitioner and experienced designer. He's written at least 2 books on the topics and is currently Chief Evangelist at Mural. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, great to be here, Vaughn. Thanks so much for asking.
Well, it's real privilege, and perhaps for some of our listeners who are just finding out about you, could you perhaps give a bit more background about yourself and what you're currently doing?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jim Kalbach. I'm the Chief Evangelist at Mural. Mural is an online native whiteboard solution. And I'm here just outside of New York City on the East Coast in the United States. I have a background in design and innovation. For a couple of decades almost, I came up through the ranks of design and innovation, both internally at large companies, but also as a consultant. And when I came to Mural, I actually moved to more of the go-to-market side of things. But I kept in touch, and I kept my roots fairly squarely grounded in that design and innovation space. And it was through that work that I came in touch with the field of Jobs to be Done, and have been working with it ever since. And then, as you mentioned, published a book on Jobs to be Done.
What's the titles there?
It's called the Jobs to be Done Playbook.
Fantastic. Well, maybe that's a good sort of segue there, Jim, just to perhaps dive into Jobs to be Done. So, from your perspective, what is Jobs to be Done, and how does it shift the way that we think about customers and innovation?
Yeah. So, Jobs to be Done has a long history. One of the misconceptions I hear is that Jobs to be Done is new. No, it's not. It's just gaining popularity, but it actually has been around for nearly 4 decades as a field of practice. It was developed by more of the business folks, Clayton Christensen, for instance, and Tony Olwick, as a way to understand the needs of the people in their market. And you just mentioned a mindset shift, or a different mindset that you need to adopt when you're working with Jobs to be Done. And that's core to what Jobs to be Done is, in my view, that it's really flipping the script, right? Rather than looking at the market, and in particular, the people that you serve, rather than looking at those people as consumers of your solution, right? Which, by the way, is not a bad view to have. It's just very biased. Rather than seeing someone and saying, hey, how can they consume my solution? How can they consume more of my solution? Or even, how can I make a better experience so that when they consume my solution, they get more value out of it? Rather than asking that question, it asks, what are they trying to get done, independent of any solution or technology, including my own? So Jobs to be Done asks you to put your own solution, your brand, your price point, your go-to-market motions, put that aside, and really look at what are those individuals trying to get done in their lives at work, right? And starting from there. So it is a mindset shift, right? Because sometimes it's hard to escape the gravity of your own solution and your own offering, your own brand, right? We're at work. because we want to sell something, and the natural tendency is to talk about that thing. But jobs to be done say, nope, let's talk about the people first, and then we can work us into the solution, right? So jobs to be done doesn't tell you what solution to create. It tells you what problem to solve from a different standpoint.
Nice. Okay. And have you seen that that framework or jobs to be done would be more successful? Like, is it applicable across all sort of products and services, or have you found it works better in particular areas?
No, I actually found that it applies better in different areas. Basically, if you have a challenge or problem to solve, I can usually throw jobs to be done at it and find some value there. Um, where I find jobs to be done is it's a little trickier, and you have to abstract away from the solution in what might feel like an awkward way, is when the space that you're trying to understand from a jobs to be done perspective is itself very technical and only exists because of technology. For instance, I was working with a cybersecurity company, right? And we can express a jobs to be done as, protect my company's data from, risks or something like that. We might express the job in that way. And then you start to do the analysis. So jobs to be done is very systematic and detailed. First, you declare the focus job, like I just did, protect my company's data from, sort of foreign threats. And then you can do the analysis and say, what are the steps to get that done? What are the outcomes that people are looking for? And you can do all of that without mentioning any technology. But then when you look at it, it's, well, wait a minute, it's security. It's a security system. So the language that you end up with is so far abstracted that you're like, well, why don't you just call it what it is? So I've found, but even then jobs to be done can help. So it's not the space it's not whether it's a service or a hardware product or a software product. It's more about the type of job actually that you're trying to understand that makes jobs to be done, I think, more applicable, more appropriate, or less appropriate. But the bottom line is, I can do jobs to be done on an analysis on anything.
Okay. With my sort of understanding around jobs to be done is obviously, I think you mentioned there that perhaps the leading job, and how often have you found the social or emotional sort of jobs or that side of it sort of outweighing, if you like, the functional side of things? Like, how important is that?
Everything is important. So jobs to be done takes in consideration aspirations. Who does the job performer want to become? It takes into account emotional and social aspects. So these are all concerns, and I don't know if I'd say one is more important than the other. However, the way the model works, at least as I approach it, is you frame your field of inquiry around the functional job, right? And that becomes your unit of analysis, right? And there's a couple of reasons why we do that. One is it makes it just a lot more tangible. If your starting point are emotions, right, it's gonna get diffused really, really quickly. Having a functional job, it has a beginning, a middle, and end, so you can map it out, and it's a lot more tangible. I wouldn't even say it's vanilla. Actually, a functional job, for instance, generally is almost a no doubt kind of thing. Oh yeah, that's self-evident, right? It's when you then start to layer all the other things, including the emotions on top of it, that you get the picture. But we still want our unit of analysis to be the functional job. And I call that the focus job or the target job, right? And that's a strategic decision that you have to make. Given a space that we're in and what we want to do as an organization, what's the functional job that people are trying to get done that best encapsulates or speaks to our value, right? The value that you create. So that becomes the unit of analysis. And then we hang these other things and we look at all of those other aspects on it. However, also the second point is that there's a theory that you can't get the emotional or social jobs done if you didn't get the functional job done, right? So imagine, and I didn't believe that until I experienced it myself. I was looking at uh, women's jeans. This was for a large online retailer, and they were in part they sold women's jeans, and we were looking at what's the job to be done, and we said, oh, they want to look good, right? And all these emotional things came out. But the biggest unmet need, or the first unmet need that we needed to challenge to tackle was fit. That if the jeans don't fit, it doesn't matter the look and the social aspect, or it doesn't matter how confident you feel in them if they don't fit. So the theory is that, yeah, the emotions and the social are good to know. And very often for marketing and solutioning, that's what you anchor on. But if you can't get the functional job done, you're not going to get to just higher order things. So we started it's almost like the center of the earth. It's like, let's strip away all these other factors, the emotions, the social aspects, the overall arching aspirations, all the different contextual factors that might play. Let's strip all that away. And at the middle is this core, right? Let's start there, understand that, and then layer all these other concerns on top of it. And I think it makes sense for lots of reasons to do that. Namely the two that I mentioned. A, it's tangible. And B, you got to get the functional job before you get the emotional job done.
Right. So yeah, I like that sort of way of thinking about it. There's even though it might be a sort of highly sort of emotive aspect in terms of messaging, marketing, like you mentioned, we've still got to achieve a sort of minimal or a core function there for them.
Yeah.
Awesome. So
it's almost always present, the functional job. So just make it your starting point. Again, it's just the starting point, and the frame is around the functional job.
Okay. And so for individuals when they're starting to perhaps apply this, in their day-to-day work, whether UX or in product or marketing, like how would you recommend that they go about approaching this?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my book, the Jobs to be Done Playbook, I don't prescribe any process. As the name implies, it's really just a collection of plays, all of which I didn't invent, right? So I'm basically giving recognition to all of the pioneers and thought leaders before me who came up with specific techniques from the Jobs to be Done field, and then I describe them, right? At the end of the book, I talk about recipes where you can take a couple of them, put them together, and kind of create a process. But that's more of a modular. It's not very prescriptive. It's kind of a Lego system of jobs to be done. However, that was 2020 when my book came out, and since then, I've been researching and teaching to what I call a core process. To answer your question, because I put the book out and people say, "Great, this is great. I understand jobs to be done. You got all this, but where do I start? How do I get started?" Right. So I believe that it's a core process that for me has 6 stages. First, you have to declare your focus job, because everything else is in relation to the focus job. The next step is to hypothesize. What do you already know about that job that you can kind of get out? What are the job steps to get it done? And you can use AI to actually help you create that hypothesis. The next stage is interviewing or research. And then from that research, you have to extract the core elements of jobs to be done. And then what you can do is you can start to prioritize and synthesize things. And this is where jobs to be done can get really, really powerful. It can give you very specific signal and very strong signal on what the unmet needs are in your marketplace. So you need to prioritize. Then you need to bring that information back to your team and activate it. You need to then take that into brainstorming and product planning and market campaign development. And there's ways that we have to do that as well too. So I've kind of described this core process of scope, hypothesize, research, analyze, prioritize, and synthesize, and then activate after that. So that's on the one side. The other thing is to look at the core elements of the jobs to be done framework. And you have the job performer, the focus job, the job steps, the success criteria, the emotions and social aspects that you were talking about, and what I call differing factors. These are the factors that make a difference in how the job gets done. And jobs to be done is very clear about sorting and separating the world, right? You keep the lights out away from the darks, and that's a strength of the toolkit. So which is all a long-winded answer to your question of if you want to get started, there is a simplified core process and some of the elements that you need to learn to get started. However, if we go back to the opening conversation that we had, if jobs to be done is really ultimately about a mindset shift, are there even smaller things you can do to get a mindset shift? And I'm like, yeah, there are. You can even just bring in the phrase, what's the job to be done into your conversations, right? It's happened to me so many times, probably to you, Vaughn, too, where you're in a product team or you're talking about requirements or whatever you're talking about, and you get so caught up in yourself, you're basically navel-gazing, right? You can lift your head back up and say, guys, what's the customer job to be done here to shift the conversation? That's one of the simplest things that you can do. But there are other simple targets like a job map, create a job map, and a job story is another format that you can just kind of work right into. You don't have to do the big process that I just described, which is simplified, by the way. I shouldn't have said big process. But there are a couple of simple things that you can do to get started. And I guess my recommendation is get started. You're never going to have a project or a big, the clouds aren't going to part and you say, well, we got 3 months now. Now we're going to do jobs. Get started now because you're going to need to ramp up and work into it anyway. Right. So just get started is my advice.
Sure. So in that sort of get started, do you sort of, I think you mentioned, hypothesis there. So and using AI. So is this about sort of leveraging a bit of a draft of what you think your assumptions around this, and then during this process you're sort of validating it to some degree with the research and things like that.
Yeah. Or I mean, yes, ideally you wouldn't take what AI says as on face value as the truth, right? And you would do some kind of validation and fleshing it out and stuff like that. But even if you didn't, just using the jobs to be done mindset, okay, I have a focused job. There has to be steps in order to get that job done. Can I go to AI to help me think about that? Okay, now when I put those up in front of my team, we can say, what are we doing next quarter? And everybody points to the same job set. You say, okay, let's organize our team and our requirements around that, the unmet needs in that job set. Even just something like that can help you bring that conversation in. Because if you think about the example that I just said, is like, where do requirements come from? How do requirements get prioritized these days? Very often, nobody knows where the requirement came from. Somebody literally made them up, or a high-level stakeholder said they wanted this thing, right? How do they get prioritized? It's like by technology, by money, by resources. What I'm suggesting here is you can get started in a very hypothesis-driven, based on assumptions, as you phrased it, right? You can get started and assume this mindset and bring the customer to the table. Rather than just technology, resources, and money, bring the customer to the table. Even if you're short-circuiting all the validation, all the customer FaceTime, and that I love and would never advocate to not do. Even if you're short-circuiting all of that, you're still bringing the customer to the table. And for me, that's more important because I'm very pragmatic about it.
So just thinking there about mindsets, or speaking to mindsets, what's the biggest obstacle? So you mentioned how we can get started, but what do you think is underlying people sort of working in that way?
Yeah. I guess there's a couple of reasons for this, but it's hard to escape the gravity of your own product, solution, and brand, right? And I'll say at the beginning of my workshops, for instance, we're not talking about technology or solutions in this course. We're only talking about customer problem. And then I think the first exercise and the first thing that people do is they include a solution in, right? And this is a more academic course. Like when you're at work and you're sitting with your product team or your team around you, and you start to think about the customer problem, it's so natural to just spit out something that is centered around your solution. Right. So that's one of the hardest things to do, is to literally not mention any technology or solutions. And sometimes people go, yeah, okay, I get that point. And like I said, and then they go to do it and they don't do it. And then I say, no, you can't say the word email, right? Or you can't say, capture notes on my iPad. You can't say iPad. You can't even say take notes, because notes is a method. That's a specific solution, right? It's just, if you're taking notes on your iPad, it's capture content. That's this job set. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it takes a little bit of practice. That's the thing, is that even if you get the theory, jobs to be done takes practice to actually execute, and to know when you're being completely solution agnostic, and to know when you're putting things into the right categories and they're formulated the right way.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I love that. So maybe just thinking a little bit more around some of the things that we can avoid. So as a company looking to sort of adopt jobs to be done, what are some of the biggest perhaps mistakes that you've seen companies go through?
I mean, to be honest with you, one of the mistakes I see these days is just kind of jumping on the bandwagon because it's hypey right now, and it's, oh, I don't know, we got to do this jobs to be done thing. Why? I don't know, because our competitors are doing it, and like not really having a good reason for it. I think first of all, so when I coach customers, I'll ask them, why do you need jobs to be done to solve this problem, right? What are you looking to do with jobs to be done? Or what's the job of jobs to be done? And I think, jobs to be done is first of all, it's very foundational. Once you do this type of analysis and some of these motions, the information doesn't change very quick. And if I create a job map for a certain focus job, it's not going to change for years or 5 years even. I've had things that are 5 years old and they're still exactly the same, precisely because we expunge technology and solutions from our language. Right? Yeah. Attending a conference is attending a conference is attending. Commuting to work is commuting to work, right? And if I don't talk about cars or flying cars or trains or bikes, the steps in commuting to work are going to be the same, whether they happened 50 years ago or 10 years in the future. So jobs to be done is foundational work. And I think one of the mistakes that I see or I kind of sense is people not necessarily approaching it that way. They're like, oh, we got a big product suite launch at the end of the year. We need jobs to be done to help us do that. It's almost like, nah, you're probably too late, actually, because all the requirements are written and stuff like that as well, too. So it needs to be tied to something that's more foundation. And usually it's around things like, you want to be more customer-centric. But I think for me, the real value of jobs to be done is finding meaningfully unique value in the marketplace, right? Another way to say that is use the word innovation, but I'd rather say meaningfully unique value, right? Is that you want to find the things that the people that you serve are struggling with, and we can call those unmet needs that nobody else has found yet, right? And base your value creation off of those things. What are the unmet needs? And then we think about what value we need to create based on those, rather than just random requirements coming in from anywhere, right? For instance, is what do people actually need before you start making the technology? So it's really think of the outcome that people want and work back towards the experience, not the other way around. That's how I phrase.
Right, and so the sort of how I'm looking at this is that the more that you can deeply understand that customer, their needs, their struggles, their whole world, in a way that's a competitive advantage, yeah?
That's right.
So you can own that space or that particular sort of challenge for that type of customer in that situation, and much more deeply. And I was recently listening to another podcast, and they were sort of framing it that way as well, that to be able to be an advantage no matter what changes in terms of technology, etc. This core need is always there.
That's absolutely right. And one of the ways that I like to illustrate that is by doing a Google search for why do startups fail. And I encourage people listening right now to Google why do startups fail. And you'll find 10 lists. Fast Company, top 10 lists, reasons why startups fail. There's all kinds. Harvard Business Review, there's all kinds of 10 lists, top 5 lists, whatever it might be. And I can guarantee that one of the top 3 answers in almost all of these lists that I've ever come across are, we didn't understand the market needs. Right? Now you might say, yeah, but Jim, we're not a startup. We're a big legacy company. And I would say, okay, Google, why does innovation fail? Innovation being create meaningfully unique value. And it's not as high as for startup failure, but it's in the top 5. One of them is we didn't understand our customers and we didn't understand our customer needs.
Yeah.
So that it's exactly what you described. That's the gap that Jobs to be Done fills.
Right, and so it's a way of centering those organizations back, if you like, to reality in some way, yeah, because it would be easy to think that we fully understand our customer and then become more and more distant, more layers between the front line and the leadership side of things.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of humility, to be honest with you. It's basically saying, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did, because I think that navel gazing that I talked about, that gives people a false sense of confidence, right? Well, we have $1 billion product on the market. We must know what we're doing, right? And guess what? That's the story of every disrupted product out there. Anytime you have marketplace disruption, it's always the incumbent thinking they know what the solution is. Well, we must know because we're successful. Oh, and there's this little company over there with this new little thing. But that's the story of disruption, is being complacent with your own position, being kind of full of yourself that you do know all the answers. So Jobs to be Done takes a little degree of humility and a little bit of willingness to say, maybe I don't know everything and there's something I can learn with this mindset shift perspective, that maybe we can uncover things that don't show up in my usage data. They don't show up in my sales data, right? So it's really about uncovering blind spots, if you want to think about it that way, blind spots that you can convert into opportunity for creating meaningfully unique value that will differentiate you in the market space.
So maybe just think a little bit more on teams. So if they've got, because you're sort of mentioning it's becoming more topical, even though it's been around for 4 decades or so. If they've got existing processes like design sprints and their existing roadmaps are already happening and they're on the mission to implement something, how would you perhaps recommend that teams can incorporate or integrate this into their existing sort of processes?
Yeah, which I do, and I don't see Jobs to be Done as something that replaces existing motions, even things that overlap or seemingly overlap with Jobs to be Done, like UX and design thinking. I think you keep those things in place and integrate the Jobs to be Done insight into it, because I believe it's more powerful and more precise and rigorous. And I think that's what a lot of business stakeholders want. They don't just want, the fuzzy brainstorming sessions with pipe cleaners and, trust us, we talked to 3 people, kind of thing. They want a little bit more precision and rigor around it. So it integrates into existing processes and it overlays on top of those. One of the things that I recommend is taking a look at your workflows. You just start with a macro level, right? So if you're in marketing, like how does a campaign get devised and launched? Well, first we sit down and we strategically look at the themes we want to go after. Okay, is there an opportunity for the team binding session or whatever the format is, the forum there is, to be infused with Jobs to be Done? Oh, well, we can bring the unmet need in there. And that can inform the themes. Okay, then the next thing we do is we create different work streams around, channels or however, a marketing campaign is playing. Okay, what are the potential touch points where you can anchor this customer-centric insight into it, right? And really just think, and you can even get down to like the document level, right? Okay. All of our marketing briefs will start off with the unmet need at the top of it. Just simple little things like that will help you then infuse that across a team or an organization. The thing about Jobs to be Done is it provides a very, very consistent language for doing it, more so than other techniques that I've come across, right? I was on many UX teams. I still consider myself roughly in the field of UX, and I know a lot of the methods. I've done commercial ethnography, contextual inquiries, usability tests, interviews, focus groups. I've done all of those things, and they're all great, by the way. And I'm not saying not do those, but just take something like contextual inquiry or ethnography. The thing that comes out of it is going to be different and unique every time you do it, and across teams and across companies, right? With Jobs to be Done, you always get these really clear packages and these, I don't want to say answers, but insights that you can then slot in. And if everybody agrees on the definition of that across your organization, you now have common language around your customer, right? So it's about taking the power of jobs to be done to give your teams a common language and finding concrete touch points in your workflow where you can.
Right. So a great way of socializing the work, but also aligning teams on where we're heading. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
And that's what jobs to be done does. I mean, you could talk about an aligning effect on the one hand, but I also think about focus. Jobs to be done brings a lot of focus, right? Because there's generally no lack of customer problems and customer complaints and right. You got a long list of customer problems to solve, and you probably have a long list of solutions that people have come up with. I've never worked with an organization that was sitting there going, we have no idea what to do. It's usually the opposite. It's usually we have way too many ideas on what to do and conflicting priorities, right? What jobs to be done can come in, and even if the jobs to be done analysis states the obvious, it still gives you very clear signal on no, focus on that one out of the 25 that you have at your disposal, and the options that you have at your disposal. Focus on this one. Why? Not because the technology resources or budget or the CEO wanted it, but that's the biggest unmet need in the marketplace, right? So it brings focus, and when you pair that with the common language, the rigorous common language, that's very powerful to align teams, right? Yes. We're all speaking the same language, and it helps us give focus. So it also cinches up the team. And that's why I like to position jobs to be done, not just as a analytic scientific tool where you get an answer, because the answer doesn't help. It's the socialization. I love that word that you use. It's how do you get the hearts and minds of the people that have to work with that a lot. So I teach jobs to be done as a collaboration tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So just thinking about a little bit of the, that process there, and you mentioned, having conversations, interviews with customers. So in terms of this process, like generally at what sort of point, if a underlying job is just not absolutely clear, how many sort of interviews or conversations with customers do you feel that you need in order to get enough of a feel for, what is the leading job and clarity around that prioritization before you perhaps move into what are some potential solutions?
It depends. It depends on the space that you're in. It depends on the complexity of the job itself. Very simple jobs, commute to work. That was an example that I used. That's probably going to be straightforward. You could probably define that target job, go out and talk to a bunch of commuters and get through your analysis pretty much in a straight line. But you bring up a really good point, because the first 3 phases that I mentioned in the core process that I now teach to are, you got to scope the focus job. Okay, what's the job that's going to frame our field of inquiry? And then hypothesize around it. What do we already know about that job and get that out? And then the next thing you do is you do interviews. So jobs to be done begins with qualitative research, but it's not necessarily 100% linear. And guess what? While you're scoping your job, you can go out and talk to a couple people, maybe informally. Maybe it's only a 15-minute hallway conversation. Like, what's the language you use here? How do you see this thing, right? Same thing when you hypothesize. You can bring colleagues together with you or subject matter experts to help them create a draft or an assumption job map, for instance, right? So it's not linear, first of all. But when you get to the interview stage, the goal is to be as clear as possible as to what the focus job is that you're researching. Again, the focus job frames your field of inquiry. All the questions, everything that you're asking is related to that focus job. So it's a strategic decision, but you might get out in the field and start talking to 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, and you're like, I think we framed this focus job wrong, right? It needs to be bigger, or it needs to be smaller, or there's actually 2 completely separate things here that I need to split up. And that I think that's part of the process, or at least the jobs to be done process would allow for that type of iteration, right? So you're not just going from stage to stage going, check, okay, I can never look back. It's a very iterative thing, particularly in those first 3 and 4 stages that I mentioned. But to answer your question directly, I think getting started, it is qualitative at first. But I think getting started and doing some of these kind of pilots and testing, it's usually, go talk to 2 or 3 people, and then if you need more, talk to another 2 or 3 people. And if you need more, talk to another, just it's almost like just keep interviewing until you have enough clarity and confidence to actually go in and do a full analysis.
Uh, so maybe just thinking a little bit there around, you mentioned that, sometimes the question or the job that we thought we were exploring, perhaps in the initial conversations, it's actually become evident that maybe it's a totally different job, or there's a couple of competing jobs here, that sort of thing. So, how have you found, or are there particular ways that you would advise around perhaps communicating that back to the leadership or the sponsor of the project, that sort of thing, to actually inform, hey, look, we're heading down the wrong path. We need to focus in on this one.
Yeah, I think, to frame it the way that I did, that, hey, we're going to scope the job and then hypothesize and then interview and then do the analysis, just to take the first 4 stages, for instance. But we're also going to leave ourselves open for iterating and going back on that. And particularly when you get to the interview phase, you don't, again, you need to enter it with humility, right? And say, we don't know. We just made a hypothesis around what the job was, but we need to validate that and clarify it. And we might have to go back. So I think it's around setting expectations is the big thing up front, that we'll learn what we don't know when we get out there and talk to folks. I find that, though, that doesn't happen too much. Like, you're pretty much going to be in the right ballpark. You might find, though, that there's an important distinction out there where your focus job is actually 2 different ones, or it's too big and it needs to be narrowed, and there's ways that you can do that by appending qualifiers on the end of it, something like that. So it's generally more just of a recalibration than, oh, we were completely off, because you're almost never completely off. You know what I mean? So it's never like, oh, you wanted to drill holes in the wall, but we sell HR products. It's like, what? You're never going to get that far. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's generally a recalibration and setting the expectations that you might have to recalibrate when you start smacking things up against real people.
Right. No, totally get that. So or maybe just switch a little bit to, I think a common understanding or a way of thinking about jobs to be done is also layering in what they call pains and gains. So could you maybe explain your interpretation of pains and gains and how that fits within your development of jobs to be done?
Yeah. I don't use that particular language too much. I know it from the value proposition canvas. That's a tool that Alexander Osterwalder over at Strategizer pioneered and popularized around coming up with what is that meaning to the unique value that you're going after. And the way that I see it is, the jobs to be done, the core process that I talked about in those key elements, that all exists and lives in what I call the problem space. A lot of people talk about the problem space and the solution space, right? What we're trying to do with jobs to be done is understand the problem to be solved, right? At some point in time, though, because, reality, we can't just do research for years and years, and it might have a couple of weeks, but then you have to bring it to a head and say, okay, how does that help us create the right solutions then? So there needs to be a bridging of that more abstract problem understanding to the very concrete solutions. And there are some techniques that help bridge that gap. A job story is an example of that. And I think the value proposition canvas is also something that helps you do that. So if you look at the value proposition canvas, you have your jobs on the far right, and then you have the pains and the gains above and below. And then on the left, you have your solution. And what are the pain relievers and the gain creators, right? So it's a way of saying, okay, if this is a job, here are the pains and gains. What are we doing to address the pains and the gains as well, too? So you start to bring the problem and the solution together. So to answer your question, for me, the pains and gains as represented in the value proposition canvas are really, it's a way to bridge the problem space with the solution space.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So just thinking now, maybe if you could, or does a particular customer success story sort of spring to mind around jobs to be done and how it helped sort of drive innovation or a startup? Do you have a case story perhaps to speak to?
Yeah, I do. Happily, we published a case study in a peer-reviewed journal around the Stepstone group. And in the UK and Germany, Stepstone is one of the largest online career platforms. Basically, job seekers and employers, and it's a matchmaking service, right? If I'm looking for a job, I can find things there, and vice versa. If I want to hire somebody, I can do that there. There's more to it than that, but it's a platform like that in the UK and in Germany. It's one of the bigger ones out there. But they were looking at a very crowded space competitively now and in the future as well, and they wanted to find differentiated value. And they looked to jobs to be done as a way to do that. But they also wanted the teams, particularly the product team that I worked with, they wanted them to be more customer centric, right? Which is, in my opinion, it's not about answering the support phone with a smile, right? And it's not about NPS, right? For me, customer centric is everybody has some mental model of what the customer needs are, and they've internalized those, right? So, hey, what are the unmet customer needs? I'll get back to you tomorrow. I got to look it up. No, if you said what are the unmet customer needs, everybody should just be talking in that language. And in fact, Stepstone's goal was to make jobs to be done coffee talk, so that when you bump into somebody at the water cooler, they're just talking about these things, and that's the common language that we talked about. So then you have this 400-person product organization where you're trying to achieve these goals. How do we get this to be the daily conversation, basically a culture change to be more customer centric? But so now you have this 400-person product organization, and you want them to be more customer centric and to internalize the customer needs, but also in a better position to find differentiated value. How do you bring that common language and at least some sense of a platform around the customer to the entire organization? And we started with a slow rollout of a train type of model, but the company Stepstone Group, they created activation teams to get people the training that they needed, and then they created enablement teams for getting jobs to be done integrated into the project work, much like we talked about. And they ended up with conventions and rituals like anchoring unmet needs at the top of sprint documentation and product requirements and things like that. So now they have a very consistent and programmatic motion around jobs to be done. And they've started to launch capabilities, new feature functionality, whatever it is, in the marketplace that's starting to draw attention and make a splash. And it's because they're playing with these new ideas. They're playing in a space that competitors haven't been, because by definition, unmet needs are unmet by anybody, right? Including your competitors. So if you can identify unmet needs and create solutions around them, you'll probably be some of the first in the market with those capabilities.
Wow. So on two fronts here, then, if I've interpreted it correctly, is that not only were they able to embed the use of the tool across the organization and it helped shift their culture to be more customer centric, the end result is they did create some unique differentiation in terms of the product offering.
Yes.
And how long a process was that?
Yeah. Both of those things.
Yeah. And how long was that process? Like was that a 4-year journey for them, or was it?
It was over 2 years. Yeah, we were looking at it. But they didn't come out of the gate right away with the full commitment and the full program. We did some training first, and that's what I did. I did some of the initial team training, 24 people. And, is this a thing for us? And then they evaluated that. And then they hired a consultancy that I often partner with in Switzerland called Benbridge, and they did a big study with a 9,000 person quantification sample size, not the interviews, the actual quantification part of it. And then they had this hard evidence of the unique value drivers, right? And then they internally created these enablement and activation teams and started rolling it out over time. So yeah, we got started about 2.5 years before we published this case study.
Wow.
And
Okay.
then you're still
So
growing. They're still working on it too. It's not done, right?
fantastic. Yeah. So there wasn't an initial kind of problem that they were facing. It was more of, hey, we want to become a more customer-centered organization, yeah?
There was a problem that the stakeholder, who was the CPO, by the way, it doesn't hurt if you have top-down support from the very beginning. He was looking at a very crowded marketplace and looking how to differentiate. The kind of piloting and getting into it slowly was with them kind of testing, is jobs to be done the right framework for finding unique differentiated value? Is it compatible with our organization? Would we have the know-how and the resources to scale it? Like they didn't just come in and say, we're going to get 400 people trained right off the bat. They kind of did it in loops, and every loop started to get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, in my work, sometimes when I first started out, I would rush in with this new way of new lens or new tool, and of course that from a practitioner's point of view, I'm super excited about the benefits of this. But really, you've got to meet the organisation where they're at in terms of their culture and their aims, and I suppose the energy that they have, depending on what sort of type of sector it is as well, to be able to sort of look at these new lenses, and that will determine how you approach bringing them in or introducing them for adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. Right, spot on.
Awesome. So look, I'm really keen to maybe just explore a little bit, if you wouldn't mind just touching on before we sort of finish up. I have a couple of sort of questions, but one is, AI is obviously going to be very important over the coming years, and you did touch on how perhaps you might use it in the first draft. But what's your perspective around AI in terms of in this space of insights, the use of it in terms of, do you see it more complementary, or do you see it sort of being a leading way of generating some of this?
I tend to see it as more complementary. What it can do several things. One is it can get you from a blank page to something very, very quickly. I mentioned the hypothesize stage in the jobs to be done process. Particularly if you're working in a field that you're unfamiliar with, right? And you have this focus job, for instance. Okay, I got to understand that. I don't know anything about that, right? It can help you get from a blank page to something quicker than doing it interview by interview, right? For instance. And I think the net effect of that is it makes you a smarter researcher, right? So you're not going into the interviews trying to build the model per se. You're going into the interviews to validate the model. And you're going into the interviews, the assumption model, or the AI created model. And you're going into the interviews to deepen that. So it makes you a smarter researcher, but it also allows you to go deeper than maybe you would have before, because you're just still slogging through the blank page syndrome. I don't even have a model yet, right? So I think it springboards and accelerates user research. But I guess it's a question or insights gathering. I think you put it, and it begs the question though: will it replace that type of research, or will it supercharge it? And the thing that I've noticed in every organization that I've been involved with is there's usually way more customer insights that they need to go get that they don't have resources to do, right? So it's not about like, hey, let's cut down your user research staff. It's like, no, they can actually get twice the amount of insight because they're smarter, quicker, more efficient researchers. So they can do more projects quickly. That's kind of how I see it. But you'll still have this, you'll still have it back and forth, right? So I might consult AI to help me come up with the focus job, but I'm also going to consult my stakeholders. And then I might consult AI to help me create a job map, but I'm still going to go out and talk to people, right? So it's kind of really this back and forth, because what I find is that AI can get 80% of it right, maybe even 90% of it right. And it'll put things out there that the humans wouldn't have thought of, and vice versa, though. That's the thing, is that sometimes I come up with things that AI didn't come up with, right? For instance, I was working on a project roughly around the field of real estate. And I was asking a home buyer about their home buying experience. And within 15 minutes, 3 different points of information in the jobs to be done framework came out that AI didn't find. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm only 15 minutes into my first interview and I already found 3 things that AI didn't find, I can't trust that it found everything, right?
Yeah, that's I think that's a great way of looking at it. It's, I'm fairly early in my AI sort of supplementing my work with it, but that's kind of my initial impression is very much, I like that word, springboard or blank page sort of starter. But in my work, what I've found is sometimes there's just these one or two comments that can come from one person or two people that you go, actually, that is really significant and really interesting to explore. And I think that's where the novel piece comes a lot of the time in innovation, right? So if AI is kind of flattening or averaging the mass, sometimes that fringe stuff is what we're after, right?
Well, that's almost always what you're after, right? Because think of how AI works, right? It's based on patterns of existing knowledge, right? It's going out there and finding patterns that already exist in the world. Now think of where differentiated value comes from. It comes from the stuff that nobody found yet, right? So AI is almost always going to miss the juicy little, again, only might be 5% bought, right? But that's the 5% that's going to give you the clues into where differentiated value is, right?
Absolutely. Love it. Love it. Maybe just to finish up there, Jim, maybe do you have one final tip for someone who's starting out using this jobs to be done? They're totally new to it. What would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, check out our resource. After I launched the book in 2020, I created the Jobs to Be Done toolkit. It's JTBD We have some free downloads there, and a couple of tools and articles and things that you can get started. So get started. The word of warning that I might give, though, is that there's a lot of different perspectives and opinions. A number of years ago, there was even kind of infighting amongst jobs to be done practitioners. So you might find a lot of different perspectives and even conflicting views of what jobs to be done is. So that's kind of why I recommended to, something like the Jobs to Be Done toolkit. Obviously, I own that property, but I think if you just Google things, you might get confused. So if you don't agree with my perspective, that's fine. But I'm just saying, start with one perspective before you start jumbling them up. But just inform yourself. Basically, the tip is inform yourself a little bit, and beware that there's a lot of conflicting and different views out there. But then the other thing I think would be to pick a small activity or exercise that you can do. And this is kind of where the Jobs to Be Done playbook comes in. Like, just think, can I map out the steps of getting a job done in a way that doesn't reference any technology or solutions, and it's well-formulated steps and is, presents a complete picture, and then facilitating a conversation around that. If you just do that, okay, what's the job that we're going after? How do people get it done? And how does that help us get aligned as a team? That's just a very small activity that you can do. Doesn't require any research or resources even, right? So basically start small with pieces of it. You don't have to go out and do the whole 6-step thing with full analysis and quantification and all these things like that. It's great if you aspire to that, but you can also get started with jobs to be done and with what I call jobs thinking, this flipping of the script, this mindset shift that we talked about at the beginning. Start practicing that and getting used to that and bringing just some small conversation starters into your teams.
Fantastic advice, Jim. Thank you very much. Huge value for me, and I'm sure that there is also for the audience. So perhaps if you could share just how people can reach out to you or get hold of you, just to, sorry, I'll say that again. Perhaps, Jim, if you wouldn't mind just sharing how people can get hold of you or reach out to you.
Yeah, sure. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I generally respond to connection requests to connect. And you can follow me there. Sometimes I'll post some content, usually around jobs to be done. But I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn and keep the conversation going.
Fantastic, Jim. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Great questions. I really appreciated it.
All right, take care now.